The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Raven's Hollow Castle like secrets waiting to be whispered. Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. His wife, Princess Isabella, had planted those roses during their first year of marriage, choosing varieties that would bloom throughout the seasons. Now, 3 years later, those same roses seemed to mock him with their beauty while his marriage crumbled in ways he never imagined possible. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times, its deep brass notes echoing through the chamber. Alexander straightened his shoulders and adjusted his navy morning coat. Today would be different. Today he would finally confront the woman who had systematically destroyed his wife's happiness and threatened the very foundation of their union. Queen Mother Evangeline had arrived at the castle 3 months ago, ostensibly to help with the upcoming harvest festival celebrations. What she had actually done was insert herself into every aspect of Isabella's daily life, criticizing her choices, undermining her authority with the household staff, and spreading whispers throughout the court about Isabella's supposed inadequacies as a future queen. Alexander had watched his vibrant, confident wife gradually withdraw into herself. Isabella, who once moved through the palace halls with grace and purpose, now seemed to shrink whenever Evangeline entered a room. The woman who had charmed foreign dignitaries and won the hearts of the common people with her genuine warmth had become hesitant and uncertain, second-guessing every decision she made. The breaking point had come just yesterday during the weekly meeting with the castle senior staff. Isabella had been presenting her plans for the new children's education program in the villages surrounding the castle when Evangeline had interrupted with a cutting remark about naive idealism and wasting the crown's resources on frivolous pursuits. The elderly woman had then proceeded to dismantle Isabella's carefully researched proposal piece by piece, all while maintaining a saccharine smile that fooled no one. Alexander had seen the exact moment his wife's spirit broke. Isabella's hands had trembled as she gathered her papers, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. She had excused herself from the meeting, citing a sudden headache, but Alexander knew better. He had found her later in their private gardens, sitting among the roses with tears streaming down her face. "She hates me," Isabella had whispered, her voice barely audible above the fountain's gentle murmur. "No matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, she finds fault with everything. Sometimes I wonder if she's right. Maybe I'm not cut out for this life after all." Those words had shattered something inside Alexander. His wife was one of the most capable, compassionate people he had ever known. She had modernized the castle's charitable programs, established new trade relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and earned the genuine affection of their subjects. Yet 3 months of Evangeline's psychological warfare had reduced her to this broken, doubting version of herself. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside his study snapped Alexander back to the present. He moved away from the window and positioned himself behind his mahogany desk, using its imposing presence to bolster his resolve. The footsteps paused outside his door, followed by a soft knock. "Enter," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his royal station. Queen Mother Evangeline swept into the room with her characteristic dramatic flair. At 62, she was still a striking woman, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her deep purple gown impeccably tailored. Her jewelry caught the morning light, diamonds and sapphires winking like cold stars against her pale skin. She had been beautiful once, Alexander could see that, but years of bitterness and manipulation had hardened her features into a mask of calculated charm. "My dear Alexander," she said, gliding forward with practiced elegance. "How wonderful to find you in your study. I was hoping we could have a little chat about the arrangements for next week's state dinner." Alexander remained standing, a deliberate choice that forced Evangeline to look up at him. "We need to talk, but not about dinner arrangements. Please, take a seat." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the conversation because her practiced smile faltered slightly. She settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, arranging her skirts with meticulous care. "You seem troubled, darling," she said, tilting her head with false concern. "Is there something weighing on your mind?" Alexander took his time settling into his own chair, using the silence to gather his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "I've been observing the changes in this household since your arrival 3 months ago. Changes that concern me greatly." Evangeline's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. "Changes? I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean." "I think you understand perfectly." Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes fixed on her face. My wife has been systematically undermined and humiliated since you took up residence here. Her confidence has been eroded, her authority questioned, and her initiatives dismissed. This since today. The mask of sweet confusion slipped from Evangeline's features for just a moment, revealing a flash of cold calculation before she quickly composed herself again. Alexander, surely you're not suggesting that I would deliberately harm dear Isabella? She's like a daughter to me. Is she? Alexander's voice carried a dangerous edge. Because the way you treat daughters in this family has always been questionable at best. The reference to Evangeline's treatment of his late sister struck home. Princess Margaret had been found dead in her chambers 5 years ago, officially ruled a suicide brought on by melancholy. But Alexander had always suspected that their stepmother's relentless criticism and emotional manipulation had driven Margaret to take her own life. The guilt of not protecting his sister had haunted him ever since, and he was determined not to let history repeat itself with Isabella. Evangeline's composure cracked slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. That's a terrible thing to suggest. Margaret's death was a tragedy that we all still grieve. Do we? Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace where portraits of his family hung in ornate frames. His finger traced the outline of Margaret's painted face, so young and full of hope, in the image. Because it seems to me that you've learned nothing from that tragedy. You're employing the same tactics with Isabella that you used with Margaret. The constant criticism, the public humiliation, the systematic destruction of self-worth. I resent these accusations, Evangeline said, rising from her chair with indignant anger. I have only tried to help Isabella adjust to royal life. If she lacks the strength of character necessary for her position, that is hardly my fault. The callous dismissal of his wife's suffering ignited Alexander's carefully controlled temper. He spun around to face her, his voice rising for the first time in the conversation. Strength of character? Isabella has more strength in her little finger than you possess in your entire being. She has endured months of your psychological torture with grace and dignity, protecting this family's reputation even as you systematically destroyed her from within. Evangeline's mask finally fell away completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. Oh, please. Your precious Isabella is weak and unsuitable for the crown. She comes from common stock, lacks proper breeding, and has no understanding of what it means to rule. I've been trying to toughen her up, to prepare her for the realities of royal life. By crushing her spirit, Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet now. By making her doubt every decision, every instinct, every quality that makes her extraordinary. That's not preparation, Evangeline. That's destruction. The two faced each other across the study like opposing armies. Years of buried resentment and hidden conflicts finally brought into the open. Outside, the castle continued its daily rhythms, servants going about their duties, guards changing shifts. But inside this room, the very foundation of the royal family was being shaken to its core. Evangeline straightened her spine, drawing herself up to her full height. I am the queen mother of this realm. I have ruled alongside 2 kings and guided this family through countless crises. I will not be lectured by a young man who chose to marry beneath his station for the sake of romantic foolishness. And I am the future king, Alexander replied with ice-cold authority. This is my castle, my family, and my wife you've been attacking. Your reign of terror ends now. The confrontation had only just begun, but already the palace seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something fundamental was about to change forever. The roses in the garden below continued to bloom, but inside the castle walls, a storm was brewing that would reshape the royal family's future in ways no one could have anticipated. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the study windows, both Alexander and Evangeline prepared for a battle that would determine not just Isabella's fate, but the very soul of the kingdom itself. The silence that followed Alexander's declaration stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. Evangeline's face had transformed from its usual mask of benign concern into something harder, more predatory. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the arm of her chair as she calculated her next move. You speak of authority, Alexander. But you forget that I have been the power behind this throne for over 2 decades, she said, her voice taking on a silky, dangerous tone. I guided your father through the merchant wars, negotiated the Treaty of Thornfield, and maintained stability when the northern provinces threatened rebellion. What has your little wife accomplished beyond organizing tea parties and planting flowers? Alexander felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain calm. Evangeline was baiting him, trying to make him lose control so she could dismiss his concerns as emotional outbursts. It was a tactic he had seen her use countless times over the years. Isabella has accomplished more in 3 years than you give her credit for, he replied evenly. The literacy programs she established in the outer villages have increased education rates by 40%. Her negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms opened new trade routes that have boosted our treasury considerably. And her work with the orphanages has provided homes for over 200 children who would have otherwise lived on the streets. Evangeline waved her hand dismissively. Minor achievements that any competent administrator could have managed. A true queen must be prepared for far greater challenges. She must be able to make hard decisions, to sacrifice personal feelings for the good of the realm. Your Isabella lacks that essential steel. What she lacks is the cruelty you seem to think is necessary for leadership, Alexander shot back. She leads through compassion and understanding, qualities that have made her beloved by our people. They see her as one of them, someone who genuinely cares about their welfare. And that is precisely the problem. Evangeline's voice rose sharply before she caught herself and regained control. A queen cannot be one of them. She must be above them, separate, commanding their respect through authority rather than seeking their affection like a performer on a stage. Alexander moved closer to where she sat, his presence imposing and threatening. Is that what you told Margaret? That she needed to be harder, colder, more like you? Did you break her down piece by piece until she couldn't bear to live with what she had become? The accusation hit its mark. Evangeline's composure cracked, and, for a moment, genuine pain flashed across her features before anger quickly replaced it. How dare you use Margaret's memory as a weapon against me? I love that girl like my own daughter. You had a strange way of showing love, Alexander replied relentlessly. Always finding fault, always demanding more, never acknowledging her achievements. She died thinking she was a failure, and you let her believe it. Evangeline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. Margaret was weak. She couldn't handle the pressures of royal life, and I tried to prepare her for what lay ahead. If she chose to take the coward's way out rather than face her responsibilities, that is not my burden to bear. The coldness in her words shocked even Alexander, who thought he understood the depths of his stepmother's callousness. To hear her dismiss Margaret's death so casually, to call his sister a coward, ignited a fury that threatened to consume his careful self-control. Get out, he said quietly, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. I beg your pardon. Get out of my study. Get out of my castle. Get out of our lives. Each word was delivered with increasing intensity. You have until sunset to pack your belongings and leave Ravenshollow. You are no longer welcome here. Evangeline's eyes widened in genuine shock. You cannot be serious. This is my home. I have every right to be here. This castle belongs to the crown, and I am its current guardian, Alexander replied with absolute finality. I am exercising my authority to remove you from the premises. Consider yourself formally banished from court. For the first time since Alexander had known her, Evangeline appeared genuinely rattled. Her careful composure crumbled as the reality of his words sank in. You're making a grave mistake, Alexander. Without my guidance, without my experience, you and that girl will destroy everything this family has built. We'll take our chances, Alexander said, moving to the door and holding it open. Sunset, Evangeline. Not a moment longer. She gathered her skirts and swept toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster, but Alexander could see the fear in her eyes. She had built her identity around being indispensable, around being the power behind the throne. The thought of being cast out, of losing her influence and position, terrified her more than any physical threat could. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. This isn't over, Alexander. You think you can simply dismiss me, but I have allies, connections throughout the court and beyond. Your naive little wife will never be safe from those who understand what real power looks like. Is that a threat? Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. It's a promise, Evangeline replied, her mask of civility finally, completely discarded. I built this kingdom's power structure, and I can tear it down just as easily. If you want to play these games, you'd better be prepared for the consequences. She left without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she strode down the corridor. Alexander stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening to the sound of her retreat fade into the distance. When silence returned, he closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly, feeling the weight of what he had just done. Banishing Evangeline had been necessary, But it also meant declaring war on one of the most politically connected women in the kingdom. She hadn't been bluffing about her allies. Over the years, she had cultivated relationships with nobles, merchants, and foreign dignitaries who valued her influence and pragmatic approach to power. Many of them would see Isabella as a threat to the established order, a dangerous idealist who might upset the delicate balance of relationships that kept the kingdom stable. A soft knock on the door interrupted his troubled thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening his shoulders and trying to push his concerns aside. Isabella entered quietly, her face pale and drawn. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her dark hair, but there was none of her usual confidence in her bearing. She moved hesitantly, as if afraid of disturbing him. "The staff said you wanted to see me," she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. Alexander's heart broke a little more at the sight of her uncertainty. This was what Evangeline had done to the woman he loved, turned her into a shadow of herself. He crossed the room quickly and took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the warm morning. "Isabella, my love, please sit down. There's something important I need to tell you." She allowed him to guide her to the sofa near the fireplace, but her posture remained tense and guarded. "If this is about the incident yesterday with the education program, I want you to know that I've been reconsidering the whole project. Perhaps your stepmother was right about it being too ambitious. I could scale it back significantly, or maybe postpone it until I have more experience." "No," Alexander said firmly, sitting beside her and taking her face gently in his hands. "You will do no such thing. That program is brilliant, necessary, and exactly the kind of initiative that will make our kingdom stronger. Don't you dare let anyone convince you otherwise." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. "But," she said, "I was being naive, that I don't understand the real costs of implementing such programs. Maybe I should focus on more traditional charitable work until I've proven myself capable of larger undertakings." Alexander felt his anger toward Evangeline flare anew. To see his strong, brilliant wife reduced to this self-doubting, apologetic version of herself was almost unbearable. "Isabella, look at me. Really look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and he could see the pain and confusion swirling in their depths. "You are not naive. You are not incapable. You are not any of the things she has tried to make you believe. You are compassionate, intelligent, and innovative. You see solutions where others see only problems. You have the vision and the heart to lead this kingdom into a brighter future. But the way she looks at me, the things she says." Isabella's voice trailed off, and she shook her head helplessly. "Will never happen again," Alexander finished firmly. "I've banished Evangeline from the castle. She's leaving today, and she won't be returning." Isabella's eyes widened in shock. "You banished the Queen Mother?" "Alexander, you can't do that for my sake. The scandal, the political ramifications. I did it for both our sakes, and for the sake of our future children who should never have to endure her poison," Alexander replied. "And, yes, there will be consequences. But some things are more important than political convenience." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of his decision. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "What if she's right, though? What if I really am unsuited for this life? What if I bring shame to your family name?" Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she finally let the tears fall. "My darling girl, the only shame would be in letting fear and cruelty win. You have already proven yourself worthy of the crown in every way that matters. Now we just need to help you remember who you really are." As Isabella cried against his shoulder, Alexander stared out the window at the rose garden below. The flowers she had planted were in full bloom, vibrant, and beautiful despite the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Like their marriage, like their love, they would weather whatever challenges lay ahead. But first, they would have to survive Evangeline's revenge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the castle's courtyard as Evangeline's carriage rolled away from Raven's Hollow, its wheels crunching over the gravel drive with finality. Alexander watched from his study window until the black carriage disappeared beyond the castle gates. But, even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Evangeline's parting words echoed in his mind like a curse, and he knew she wasn't the type of woman to accept defeat gracefully. Isabella had fallen asleep in his arms after her tears had finally subsided, exhausted by months of emotional trauma and the shock of learning about Evangeline's banishment. Alexander had carried her to their private chambers and covered her with a soft blanket, marveling at how young and vulnerable she looked in sleep. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of too many restless nights, too many hours spent questioning her worth and capabilities. Now, as evening approached, Alexander found himself in the castle's war room, poring over intelligence reports and correspondence with his most trusted advisor, Lord Marcus Hartwell. Marcus had served the crown for over 30 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the kingdom's political landscape. If anyone could help Alexander navigate the treacherous waters ahead, it was him. The Queen Mother has considerable influence with the Merchant Council, Marcus said, spreading several documents across the oak table. His weathered face was grave as he traced trade routes on a map with his finger. She's been instrumental in maintaining favorable relationships with the northern trading houses, particularly the Blackwood and Greystone families. Alexander studied the documents, recognizing names and signatures that represented millions of gold pieces in annual trade revenue. How likely are they to withdraw their support based on her recommendations? Very likely, Marcus admitted reluctantly. Lord Blackwood in particular has never been comfortable with Princess Isabella's common birth. He's old-fashioned in his views about bloodlines and breeding. If Evangeline convinces him that the princess is unfit to rule, he could persuade the others to reduce their investments in our kingdom. The implications were staggering. The northern trade routes provided nearly 40% of the kingdom's wealth, funding everything from the standing army to the infrastructure projects that kept their people employed and prosperous. A significant reduction in trade would force Alexander to raise taxes, cut services, or both, either of which could lead to civil unrest. What about our military alliances? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. General Aldrich of the Western Alliance has always been skeptical of Princess Isabella's influence on foreign policy. He believes her humanitarian initiatives signal weakness to our enemies. Evangeline has been feeding into those concerns for months. Alexander felt a familiar surge of anger at the injustice of it all. Isabella's humanitarian work had actually strengthened their position with several neighboring kingdoms, earning goodwill that had prevented at least 2 potential conflicts from escalating into war. But men like Aldrich only understood strength measured in soldiers and siege engines, not in hearts and minds won through compassion. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice growing heavier with each revelation. I've received word that several minor nobles are planning to petition the High Council, claiming that the princess's common birth makes any potential heirs illegitimate in the eyes of ancient law. This was the blow Alexander had been dreading. The High Council consisted of 12 ancient noble families who claimed their authority predated the current royal line. While their power was mostly ceremonial in modern times, they retained the theoretical right to challenge succession claims if they could prove irregularities in bloodline or marriage legitimacy. The law hasn't been invoked in over 2 centuries, Alexander said, though even as he spoke, he knew that precedent wouldn't necessarily protect them. No, but that doesn't mean it's been forgotten, Marcus replied grimly. Lord Ravencrest has been researching historical precedents for weeks. He's found at least 3 cases where marriages to commoners were annulled retroactively by noble decree. Alexander slammed his fist on the table, sending several documents scattering to the floor. This is madness. Isabella is beloved by the people, respected by foreign dignitaries, and has proven herself capable in every aspect of royal duty. They want to destroy her because she wasn't born in a castle. I'm afraid the nobility sees things differently, Marcus said quietly. To them, bloodline isn't just tradition, it's a guarantee of loyalty and understanding. They fear that someone from outside their ranks might introduce ideas or policies that threaten their established privileges. The door to the war room opened, and Isabella entered quietly, looking refreshed but still fragile after her rest. She had changed into a deep green gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and her dark hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style. Despite everything she had endured, she still carried herself with the grace that had first caught Alexander's attention years ago. I hope I'm not interrupting something important, she said, though her eyes had already taken in the scattered documents and the serious expressions on both men's faces. Never, Alexander said, rising to pull out a chair for her. Actually, your timing is perfect. We were just discussing the political situation in light of today's events. Isabella settled into the chair with visible reluctance, clearly dreading what she was about to hear. How bad is it? Marcus glanced at Alexander, who nodded for him to proceed. I won't lie to you, Your Highness. The Queen Mother's departure has created significant challenges. She's likely to use her influence to turn several key allies against the crown. Against me, you mean? Isabella corrected with bitter accuracy. This is all because Alexander chose to marry beneath his station. This is because a group of entitled, narrow-minded individuals refused to accept change, Alexander said firmly. The same people who would have criticized any choice I made, because they profit from chaos and instability. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, staring at the maps spread across the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with pain. Maybe I should leave. If my presence is causing such division, perhaps the kingdom would be better served if I stepped aside. Absolutely not, Alexander said with such force that both Isabella and Marcus startled. I won't even entertain that possibility. You are my wife, my partner, and the future queen of this realm. We face these challenges together, or not at all. But the cost, Isabella began. The cost of giving in to bullies and bigots would be far higher, Alexander interrupted. If we allow them to dictate who can and cannot be part of this family, we set a precedent that will haunt this kingdom for generations. Our children would grow up knowing that love, merit, and character matter less than the circumstances of birth. Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears than the ones she had shed earlier. These spoke of gratitude and renewed determination rather than despair. What do you need me to do? Alexander felt a surge of pride at her courage. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who faced challenges head-on rather than running from them. We need to remind people why they fell in love with you in the first place. Your education program, your trade negotiations, your work with the orphanages, all of it needs to be documented and publicized. We need to show the kingdom that you're not just a princess by marriage, but a leader by choice and action. Marcus nodded approvingly. A campaign of public works and appearances would help counter the narrative that you're somehow unfit for royal duties. The people already love you, but we need to make sure their voices are heard by the nobility. We also need to address the legitimacy question directly, Alexander added. I want you to research every legal precedent supporting marriages between nobility and commoners. Find examples of successful unions, children who inherited titles. Anything that proves this controversy is manufactured rather than based in genuine legal concern. Isabella straightened in her chair, and Alexander could see the spark of purpose returning to her eyes. I'll start immediately, and I want to accelerate the education program rather than delaying it. Let them see what naive idealism can actually accomplish. That's my brave girl, Alexander said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that Evangeline won't limit herself to political maneuvering. She's desperate and angry, which makes her dangerous in ways we might not anticipate. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and the clatter of armor suggested some kind of emergency. Alexander was halfway to the door when it burst open, revealing Captain Henrik of the Royal Guard, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Your Majesty, he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. We've intercepted a message from the Queen Mother to Lord Blackwood. She's not just seeking political support. She's planning to claim that Princess Isabella poses a threat to the crown itself. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as Henrik handed him a sealed letter bearing Evangeline's distinctive wax seal. With trembling fingers, he broke it open and read the contents, his expression growing darker with each line. What does it say? Isabella asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Alexander looked up from the letter, his eyes burning with fury and determination. She's accusing you of treason. She claims you're a foreign agent sent to destabilize the kingdom from within. The war room fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Outside, night was falling over Ravenshollow Castle, but inside, a different kind of darkness was gathering. Evangeline had just declared total war on their marriage, their crown, and their future. The real battle was only beginning. The accusation of treason hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, threatening to suffocate everything Alexander and Isabella had built together. In the flickering candlelight of the war room, the letter seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its carefully crafted words designed to destroy lives and topple kingdoms. Isabella read the letter with growing horror, her face growing paler with each fabricated claim. According to Evangeline's twisted narrative, Isabella's educational programs were actually information-gathering operations for foreign enemies. Her successful trade negotiations were portrayed as treasonous attempts to weaken the kingdom's economy by making it dependent on hostile neighbors. Even her work with orphanages was twisted into a sinister plot to recruit abandoned children as future spies. "This is insane," Isabella whispered, her hands shaking as she set the letter down. "How can anyone believe such ridiculous accusations?" "Lies don't have to be believable to be effective," Marcus said grimly. "They just have to plant seeds of doubt. Once people start questioning your motivations, every good deed can be reinterpreted as evidence of conspiracy." Alexander paced the length of the room like a caged lion, his mind racing through possible responses and their consequences. She's not just trying to remove Isabella from court. She's attempting to have her executed for treason. This goes beyond political maneuvering into outright murder. Captain Henrik shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly struggling with the implications of what he had discovered. "Your Majesty, there's more. Our sources indicate that copies of this letter have already been sent to at least 6 major noble houses, as well as General Aldrich of the Western Alliance." The room fell silent as the full scope of Evangeline's plan became clear. She wasn't content with simply discrediting Isabella or forcing her into exile. She was orchestrating a complete character assassination designed to make Isabella's execution seem not just justified, but necessary for the kingdom's survival. "We need to get ahead of this," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We need to disprove these allegations before they take root in people's minds." "With respect, Your Majesty, that may be impossible," Marcus said carefully. "Proving a negative is one of the most difficult tasks in politics. How do you prove that educational programs aren't spy networks? How do you demonstrate that charitable work isn't recruitment for foreign agents?" Isabella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "We don't prove negatives. We prove positives." Her voice was stronger now, filled with the determination that had first attracted Alexander to her. "We show them the results of my work, the real, tangible benefits to the kingdom and its people." "Explain," Alexander said, recognizing the strategic mind that lurked beneath his wife's compassionate exterior. Isabella moved to the map table, pointing to various locations marked with different colored pins. "The literacy programs in the outer villages. We bring in the children who learn to read, their parents who now run successful businesses because they can manage written contracts. We let them tell their stories." She traced a line along the eastern trade routes. "The trade negotiations that supposedly weakened us? We present the treasury records showing increased revenue, the employment figures for the new trading posts, the testimonies of merchants whose profits have increased because of better relationships with our neighbors." Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face showing the first glimmer of hope since this crisis began. "You want to turn this into a public trial of your accomplishments rather than your alleged crimes." "Exactly," Isabella said, her confidence growing as the plan took shape. "Evangeline's accusations rely on people not knowing the details of my work. But we have documentation for everything. Letters from foreign dignitaries praising our diplomatic approach. Financial records showing the positive impact of our trade policies. Testimonials from families whose lives have been improved by our charitable programs." Alexander felt a surge of admiration for his wife's strategic thinking. Even after months of psychological assault, even facing accusations that could literally cost her life, she was thinking like the queen she was meant to be. "We'll need to move quickly," he said. "Evangeline's poison is already spreading through the noble houses. If we wait too long, public opinion may become impossible to change." Captain Henrik cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, I should mention that Lord Ravencrest has already begun spreading his own version of events among the minor nobility. He's claiming that Princess Isabella's common birth makes her susceptible to foreign manipulation, that her lack of proper breeding means she can't truly understand royal loyalty." The mention of Ravencrest's involvement added another layer of complexity to their situation. As one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom, the Ravencrests commanded significant respect among the aristocracy. Their support of Evangeline's accusations would lend them credibility that might be difficult to overcome. "Ravencrest has his own motives," Marcus observed. "His daughter was considered a potential bride for you before you met Isabella. This isn't just about bloodlines for him. It's personal." Isabella's jaw tightened at this revelation. "So this is partly about a woman scorned? About noble pride wounded because the prince chose love over political convenience?" "Partly," Alexander confirmed. "But that makes it more dangerous, not less. Personal grudges can be more persistent than political disagreements." Ravencrest won't be satisfied with just discrediting you. He wants revenge. A new voice spoke from the doorway, causing everyone to turn in surprise. Then, perhaps it's time we gave him something more immediate to worry about. The speaker was Lady Catherine Thornfield, one of Isabella's closest friends and allies among the younger nobility. At 26, she was nearly Isabella's age and had been instrumental in helping the princess navigate the complex social dynamics of court life. Her arrival was unexpected but welcome, as the Thornfield family wielded considerable influence among the progressive faction of nobles. "Catherine," Isabella said with obvious relief. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know that the kingdom is about to tear itself apart over manufactured controversies," Catherine replied, sweeping into the room with characteristic confidence. Her auburn hair was slightly disheveled, and her traveling cloak suggested she had ridden hard to reach the castle. "What do you mean about giving Ravencrest something to worry about?" Alexander asked. Catherine smiled grimly. "I've spent the last 3 days visiting allies throughout the eastern provinces. The younger nobles, the progressive merchants, the military officers who've actually worked with Isabella's programs rather than just hearing about them secondhand. They're ready to publicly support the princess, but they need leadership and coordination." Alexander felt a spark of hope for the first time since this crisis began. "You're talking about organizing a counter-movement." "I'm talking about organizing the truth," Catherine corrected. "Ravencrest and his allies represent the old guard, the nobles who profit from keeping things exactly as they've always been. But there's a growing faction that recognizes the value of Isabella's innovations, the potential for positive change that she represents." Marcus nodded slowly, his strategic mind already working through the possibilities. A public show of support from progressive nobles would force the traditionalists to defend their position rather than simply attacking ours. It changes the dynamic from accusation and defense to a genuine debate about the kingdom's future. Isabella looked around the room at the faces of her supporters, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. "What would you need from me?" "Everything we discussed earlier," Catherine said. "Documentation of your achievements, testimonials from people you've helped, financial records proving the success of your initiatives. But also something more personal. The people need to see who you really are, not the version of you that Evangeline has been spreading through whispered rumors." "A public address?" Alexander suggested. "More than that," Catherine replied. "A progress through the kingdom, visiting the places where Isabella's work has made a difference. Let the people see her, speak with her, judge for themselves whether she's a foreign agent or a dedicated servant of the crown." The plan was ambitious and risky. Taking Isabella on a public tour while accusations of treason swirled around her could either vindicate her completely or provide her enemies with opportunities to stage incidents that would support their claims. But the alternative, hiding in the castle while Evangeline's poison spread unchecked, was almost certain to result in disaster. "There's one more thing," Catherine added, her expression growing serious. "I have it on good authority that Evangeline isn't working alone. She's been in secret communication with Prince Dimitri of Valdoria." The name sent a chill through the room. Valdoria was a neighboring kingdom with a history of territorial ambitions and military aggression. Prince Dimitri was known for his ruthless pragmatism and his belief that showing weakness invited conquest. "What kind of communication?" Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would be deeply troubling. "The kind that promises Valdorian support for a regime change," Catherine replied grimly. "If Isabella can be removed and discredited, if the kingdom descends into civil war over the succession, Dimitri sees an opportunity to present himself as a stabilizing force, possibly even as an alternative ruler." The full scope of Evangeline's treachery was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about removing Isabella or restoring the old guard to power. This was about potentially destroying the kingdom itself in service of foreign interests. "Now who's the traitor?" Isabella said with bitter irony. Alexander's expression hardened into something cold and implacable. "Now we know what we're really fighting for. Not just our marriage or our crown, but the very survival of our kingdom." Outside the castle walls, storm clouds gathered in the night sky, promising rain and wind to match the tempest brewing within the palace walls. But inside the war room, for people began planning a campaign that would determine not just their personal fates, but the future of everyone they had sworn to protect. The battle for the heart and soul of the kingdom was about to begin in earnest. 3 weeks had passed since the night of revelations in the war room, and the kingdom trembled on the edge of civil war. The truth about Evangeline's conspiracy with Prince Dmitri had spread through the court like wildfire, dividing nobles into increasingly hostile camps. Those who supported Isabella rallied around evidence of her accomplishments and dedication to the realm, while Evangeline's supporters doubled down on their claims of foreign manipulation and royal incompetence. Alexander stood in the castle's great hall, surrounded by the tangible proof of his wife's innocence and virtue. Tables groaned under the weight of documents, ledgers, and testimonials that painted a picture of remarkable achievement rather than treasonous conspiracy. Letters from grateful villagers whose children could now read and write. Financial records showing increased prosperity in regions where Isabella's trade negotiations had opened new markets. Reports from orphanages transformed from overcrowded, underfunded institutions into thriving communities where abandoned children found hope and purpose. The centerpiece of their defense was a series of sworn statements from foreign dignitaries who had worked directly with Isabella. The ambassador from the Eastern Kingdoms had written at length about her skillful mediation during a border dispute that could have escalated into war. The trade minister from the coastal republics had documented how her innovative approach to commercial agreements had benefited all parties involved. Even representatives from traditionally hostile neighbors had acknowledged her fair dealing and genuine commitment to peaceful coexistence. Isabella herself had been transformed by the fight for her reputation and her marriage. The uncertain, apologetic woman who had been broken down by Evangeline's psychological warfare had given way to a fierce defender of truth and justice. She moved through the preparations with renewed purpose, no longer questioning her worth or her place in the royal family. "The Merchant Council has agreed to testify on your behalf," Lady Catherine announced as she entered the hall with a stack of fresh documents. "Lord Blackwood himself wants to publicly apologize for doubting your trade policies. Apparently, his family's profits have increased by 30% since your negotiations opened the northern routes." Alexander felt a surge of satisfaction at this development. Blackwood's support was crucial not just for its political weight, but for what it represented. Here was a man who had initially opposed Isabella based on prejudice and traditional thinking, but who had been won over by undeniable results. "What about the military situation?" Isabella asked, looking up from a table where she was organizing testimonials from grateful families. Catherine's expression grew more serious. "General Aldrich has withdrawn his support for Evangeline's claims, but he's not actively supporting us either. He's taking a neutral position, waiting to see how events unfold. However, Colonel Morrison and the younger officers are firmly in our camp. They remember how your diplomatic work prevented the Thorns Hire rebellion from spreading to the military." The political landscape was shifting, but Alexander knew they couldn't rely on passive support. They needed to force a decisive confrontation that would settle the matter once and for all. The opportunity came sooner than expected when a messenger arrived with urgent news from the capital. "Your Majesty," the messenger said, bowing low as he delivered his sealed dispatch. "The High Council has agreed to convene a formal hearing on the question of royal legitimacy. They're demanding that both you and Princess Isabella appear before them within the fortnight." Alexander broke the seal and read the official summons, his jaw tightening with each formal phrase. The High Council's involvement represented both opportunity and danger. If they ruled in favor of Isabella's legitimacy, the matter would be settled permanently. But if they sided with the traditionalists, the consequences could be catastrophic. "This is what Ravencrest has been working toward," Marcus observed, reading over Alexander's shoulder. "A formal challenge to the marriage that would give legal weight to their political objections. Then, we'll give them a formal defense that settles the matter permanently," Isabella said with steel in her voice. "I want every piece of evidence, every testimonial, every document that proves my value to this kingdom. Let them question my bloodline all they want. I'll show them that nobility of character matters more than nobility of birth." Alexander felt a surge of pride at his wife's courage. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, the leader he knew she could be. "We'll need witnesses," he said. "People who can speak to your character and achievements from personal experience." "I've already begun compiling a list," Catherine said, producing another document. "Village elders whose communities have prospered under your education programs. Merchants whose businesses have grown thanks to your trade policies. Military officers who've seen how your diplomatic skills prevented conflicts. Even some of the orphans you've helped, now grown into productive citizens." The preparations consumed the following days as they built their case with the thoroughness of generals planning a crucial battle. Every achievement was documented, Every policy decision was justified. Every positive outcome was traced back to Isabella's influence and leadership. They gathered a mountain of evidence that painted a picture of competence, compassion, and unwavering loyalty to the kingdom's interests. But their most powerful weapon proved to be something unexpected. Among the documents Catherine had collected was a letter that had been sitting in the archives, overlooked until now. It was written in King Edward's own hand, Alexander's grandfather, and one of the most revered rulers in the kingdom's history. "Listen to this," Alexander said, his voice filled with wonder as he read from the faded parchment. "The strength of a royal house lies not in the purity of its bloodline, but in the purity of its purpose. A true queen is known not by the circumstances of her birth, but by the consequences of her choices. I would rather see my heir marry a commoner of noble heart than a princess of common character." Isabella's eyes filled with tears as the words sank in. Here was validation from one of the kingdom's greatest kings, written decades before she was born, yet speaking directly to their situation. "When did he write this?" Isabella asked. Marcus studied the date on the letter carefully. "It appears to be from his private correspondence during the succession crisis of 40 years ago. He was addressing similar concerns about bloodline purity that were being raised by nobles of that era. The letter provided more than just moral support. It gave them legal precedent. If King Edward had explicitly stated that nobility of character outweighed nobility of birth, then the High Council would be hard-pressed to rule against Isabella without contradicting one of their most revered monarchs. The day of the hearing arrived with autumn storms battering the castle windows and winds howling through the ancient stones like the voices of anxious spirits. Alexander and Isabella rode to the capital together, their carriage surrounded by loyal guards and followed by a procession of supporters who wanted to witness this crucial moment in their kingdom's history. The High Council chamber was a magnificent hall built in the early days of the kingdom, its vaulted ceiling decorated with the heraldic banners of the 12 founding families. The council members sat in throne-like chairs arranged in a semicircle, their faces grave with the weight of the decision they would be asked to make. Lord Ravencrest presented his case first, arguing that ancient law required royal marriages to maintain bloodline purity, and that exceptions weakened the crown's authority. His words were polished, and his logic seemingly sound, but Alexander noticed that he offered no specific examples of how Isabella's common birth had actually harmed the kingdom. When it came time for their defense, Isabella rose to address the council herself, ignoring the tradition that would have had Alexander speak for her. Her voice was clear and strong as she presented the evidence of her achievements, the testimonials of grateful citizens, and the concrete benefits her policies had brought to the realm. "My lords," she concluded, "you may judge me by my ancestry, or you may judge me by my actions. You may focus on where I came from, or you may consider where I have helped lead this kingdom. I cannot change the circumstances of my birth, but I can demonstrate the consequences of my choices, and I believe those consequences speak for themselves." The dramatic moment came when Alexander presented King Edward's letter. As the words of the beloved monarch were read aloud, several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing that their arguments had just been undermined by unimpeachable royal authority. Lord Ravencrest made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position, arguing that times had changed since King Edward's era and that modern threats required traditional stability. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence supporting Isabella's competence and loyalty. After hours of deliberation, the High Council returned with their verdict. The chamber fell silent as the eldest member, Lord Ashford, rose to deliver their judgment. "The council finds that Princess Isabella has proven herself worthy of her position through deed and character. Her common birth is ruled irrelevant in light of her noble service to the realm. Furthermore, any future challenges to this marriage based solely on bloodline concerns are hereby forbidden." The hall erupted in cheers from Isabella's supporters, while Ravencrest and his allies sat in stunned silence. Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Not only had they won, but they had won decisively, with legal precedent that would protect their future children from similar challenges. But the sweetest victory came in the weeks that followed, when word reached them that Evangeline's conspiracy with Prince Dimitri had been exposed to the other kingdoms. Faced with evidence of her treasonous communications, she had been arrested by Valdorian authorities and charged with conspiracy against their own crown. Her attempt to use foreign influence to destabilize Alexander's kingdom had ultimately destroyed her own position and reputation. As autumn gave way to winter, peace returned to Ravenshollow Castle. Isabella's confidence had been fully restored, stronger than ever for having been tested in the crucible of political warfare. The education programs that had been suspended during the crisis were expanded and accelerated. New trade agreements were signed with kingdoms impressed by Isabella's integrity under pressure. The orphanages she championed received increased funding as grateful nobles sought to demonstrate their support for the vindicated princess. Alexander found his wife in their private garden one snowy evening, tending to the roses they had planted together years earlier. The flowers were dormant now, preparing for winter's rest, but their roots ran deep, and their return in spring was assured. "Any regrets?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Isabella leaned back against him, watching the snowflakes dance in the lamplight. "Only that it took so long for me to remember who I really was. Evangeline almost succeeded in making me forget my own worth." "But you remembered when it mattered most," Alexander said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You stood up to scrutiny that would have broken weaker people. You proved that true nobility comes from within." As they stood together in the peaceful garden, the castle warm and secure around them, both Alexander and Isabella understood that they had fought for more than just their marriage or their positions. They had fought for the principle that worth should be measured by character and achievement rather than accident of birth. Their victory had not just secured their own future, but had opened the door for a more just and meritocratic kingdom. The palace no longer shook with uncertainty and fear. Instead, it stood solid and strong, founded on love, truth, and the unshakable conviction that nobility of spirit would always triumph over nobility of blood. Their greatest test had become their greatest triumph, and the kingdom was stronger for having weathered the storm together.